Welcome to another episode of Mission Compliance, Unleashing Growth Potential for Defense Contractors. In today's episode, we continue down the road of understanding CMMC, its regulations, and controls. Up next is AC L2-3.1.15, Authorize remote execution of privileged commands and remote access to security-relevant information. We'll break down what this control means, why it matters, and how it impacts your organization's cybersecurity posture. We'll also provide practical insights and strategies for achieving compliance and securing your systems effectively. So whether you're a defense contractor aiming to win more defense contracts, or simply someone interested in bolstering your cybersecurity knowledge, you're in the right place. Here we go. We're joined once again today by Mike Frieder, President of On-Call Compliance Solutions and a CMMC Professional Assessor. Thanks for joining us, Mike.
Hey, always a pleasure, Roman.
So, Mike, this week we're talking about logging authorization for the execution of privileged commands, such as installing a piece of software. With that being said, why are these authorizations and logging these permissions so important?
That's a great question, Roman. So this is an often misunderstood control, and basically, what this is really all about is making sure that if you're going to have people able to administrate the system when they are not local to what they're administrating, in other words, remote execution, that they have an understanding that there need to be some safeguarding controls in place. And, generally speaking, a lot of this really is built into most systems that would be used to administrate a system, but nonetheless, NIST felt that it was something that was important enough that, again, in case your system is custom designed, for instance, that you still have these safeguards in place. So as we break this down, and we'll break it down in a couple segments, right? So it's first authorize remote execution of privileged commands. So again, something you're doing remotely, you're not directly on the device. And remote access to security relevant information. So again, any kind of remote access to whatever may be security relevant, all of those things need to be authorized, which means there needs to be some sort of mechanism for authorization, and someone can't just sort of come across those things just because they're in the network, is sort of how this amounts to. So again, I think for the most part in modern day systems that are sort of, coming from a manufacturer like Microsoft or something like that, it's all going to be built in. But meanwhile, the other part of this is if you've custom designed elements of your system, which is not unusual, it should act as a guide for what needs to be there. So that's really, I think, what this one is all about.
Yeah, I think simply put, if a certain action or a command requires an authorized user, it's important to keep a log of those authorized users so that any unauthorized personnel can't sneak around and perform these functions, right? So what are the key assessment points that an assessor would be looking for on this one?
Yeah, and I have to be honest, it's the first question is kind of tough on this one because it's much easier to really dive in and look at what an assessor is really looking for. And on this one, there's several assessment points. So the first one is determine if privileged commands authorized for remote execution are identified. And so then, what do we answer that? Well, how do we identify a command when it's executed remotely? How do we identify that? Well, the simplest place to really identify that turns out to be your SIEM solution, right? What does the SIEM solution do? Well, it's crunching through the logs that are generated when things are executed, and particularly executed remotely. And it's going to tell you when there are things that have been executed remotely, and that's how you're going to identify those commands that were executed. It's all about the SIEM solution. Obviously, 15 controls into NIST SP 100-171, we're really beginning to see just how important a security information and event management system is. And again, the last two letters in SIEM, event management, that's what this is all about. And the event management is how we're going to do the identification. So that's sort of assessment point number one. Number two is determine security relevant information authorized to be accessed remotely is identified. So now, are we identifying what is security relevant information? And there's obviously a lot of different ways to identify information. You can tag the information if you have some sort of a document management or a tagging system, or the easy way to do it is to say, yes, determined by file system permissions, right? So maybe privileged security information is held in a separate system or separate folder with permissions. ACLs, so access control lists, and system access capabilities. Like maybe you don't even have the capability of accessing that secure information within your system. So lots of ways to do that. You can obviously sort of say something in your answer to the extent of, different kinds of information are tagged in different ways. And those tags allow you to limit who has access to information that's been tagged in a certain way. You could also really dive deep and you could talk about DLP or data loss prevention. But again, not every system really has that functionality. And so I think that the really basic stuff is file system permissions, access control lists, and even just generally who can even access those systems via system access capabilities. Those are the things that really, I think, make sense here. Next, determine if the execution of the identified privilege commands via remote access is authorized. So again, making sure that it's actually authorized that they're executing what they're executing. So there's lots and lots of ways to do this here. And again, a lot of times when we give these answers, we try to break it down to the lowest common denominator. So one method that you can determine this is we can use group policy. We can say group policy prohibits the execution of privileged commands via remote access for non-privileged users. The SEAM solution logs all privileged command executions which are authorized. So again, a combination of group policy to prohibit the execution seem to verify that something actually happened. And again, that's how we would determine if the execution of identified privilege commands via remote access is actually authorized, or if it's not authorized. Again, the SEAM will catch that. Final assessment point is determining if access to the identified security relevant information via remote access is authorized. So again, determine if access to the identified security relevant information via remote access is authorized. So how do we determine if somebody can access something? Well, we can say only those users who are authorized to access security relevant information and authorized for remote access may perform this function. And that's obviously a pretty limited subset of users. One, they've got to have remote access, and two, they've got to be authorized to actually have access to that specific kind of information. And then again, we have our SEAM and other tools that are watching over all of that happening in real time. So again, that's sort of how all of that works. And again, if you were an assessor, that's exactly what you'd be looking for in an answer.
Awesome. But are there any potential difficulties in enacting this one, or is there anything you've seen when you've been helping people get compliant with this one?
Yeah, I think this is a very interesting control in terms of a lot of what the control is really calling out for is going to be built into other systems that aren't specifically meant to do this. So for instance, the most common thing we see is that there's no SEAM system in place. There's just no security information and event management. We really can't stress the concept of how important a SEAM solution is, because without a SEAM solution, you're flying blind. You really have no idea what's going on in your network. Again, you'll notice that SEAM is basically in 3 out of the 4 assessment point answers. So that's one thing I would definitely be aware of. Authorizing remote access, again, you want to be aware of what users actually have remote access. And I think that's a really huge one that people overlook. Somebody may be given remote access for one reason or another, but then they, for whatever reason, don't need that access anymore. And it's oftentimes never revoked. So if you're not auditing who has remote access, I think it's a really good way and a good time. Maybe this is a good reminder to go ahead and do that just from a security perspective. And then, finally, I think, from a difficulty perspective, I don't think it's really super difficult to implement this. I do think that really the big thing is you shouldn't have 5 or 6 different methods of remote control in a network. And I think this control does make you pay attention to that sort of thing. It makes you list out how you're determining if the execution of the identified privilege commands via remote access is authorized, which should point your attention to, well, if I've got 5 different ways of remote access and I've got to write all those down and document all those, maybe we can consolidate and only have 1 or 2 windows that are open instead of 5 or 6 windows that are open for vulnerability. So just sort of another key point there as well. But yeah, it's again really kind of interesting because this is one of those controls. Theoretically, the reality is you really kind of get an easy pass on it as long as you have all the right tools in place. And maybe that really is the difficult part, is just making sure you have all the right tools in place and that you've got somebody watching over that. I would probably say the final piece of this is, you should have some sort of access control policy. That's another big piece of documentation that I think the auditors are going to be looking for. They're going to be looking for an access control policy so that you have written guidelines on who can access what. And I think that's pretty important. So I think those are all the major points that I would say could challenge you in terms of implementation. It's a great question.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great topic and a great a lot of information as far as making sure that you're secure your remote activity, that nobody that's not authorized can't get in. But that brings us to our favorite part of the podcast where we get a little bit silly. And when I was trying to come up with a silly question for this one, I got a few options and I just wanted to bring them up so we can laugh about them. And then a very important question for you at the end of this. The first silly question that I came across was if a remote command is executed in a forest, does it make a sound?
The answer is that's a good question. Uh, the answer is if you've got a seam solution in place, of course it makes a sound. But if you don't have a seam solution in place, there's no sound whatsoever, and it never happened.
Oh man. The next thing that which that goes to show you the importance of a seam solution. But the next thing I have on here is what's the best way to authorize a command to order pizza remotely?
Well, that's a good question. I'd probably say Uber Eats.
There you go. There
Yeah,
you
that's right. So the real question is, do your kids have access to the credit card to be able to order that pizza? Is that
go.
credit card privileged security information? So maybe that's, Roman, maybe that's one of the best ways to really give an example of how this control really works, which is your kids, they're hanging out and they're like, I want pizza. And do they have access to security relevant information such as the credit card that will empower them to go and order said pizza? Well, it depends. Are they authorized to order the pizza? Well, if they got the credit card, they can use the credit card as their remote access to get pizza delivered, remotely by Uber Eats. And if they're not authorized, well, then don't give them access to their credit card. Don't give them access to the Uber Eats account. And looks like they're eating liver and onions again.
Well, that second question is making me hungry, which brings me to an important not silly, but a good question. Well, what's your go-to pizza order?
Oh, what is my go-to pizza order? But I tell you what, first off, mellow mushroom for sure.
Oh yeah, great choice.
Love me some mellow mushroom, and I'll tell you what, I'm a meat guy, not a big veggie guy. So honestly, just a simple pepperoni pizza. But I do like to dip into the red sauce, so I'll always order like a little bit of extra marinara sauce. Big dips, love it. And you know what? I don't mind some bacon on the pizza. I don't mind a little bit of sausage. So meat it up. I'm all good with it. How about you?
There you go. For me, uh, I my go-to pizza is just simple, usually pepperoni and sausage, but there's a local place where we are recording this here in Jacksonville, Florida, where they have a really good buffalo chicken, and it's got a little bit of a kick. It's a little bit spicy. It's from a place called Biggie's, and if you happen to be local to the Jacksonville area, you should try Biggie's Pizza. And the Buffalo Soldier is the way to go. But for those who are listening and watching, Mike said he's not a big veggie guy, he's a big meat guy. I can attest to this because we went out to dinner one time. He ordered the fajitas and say, I don't want any of the veggies, just bring me a platter of meat. And I looked at him and I said, I've always dreamed of ordering food the way you just did. And that was that. And they literally just brought him a sizzling platter of beef on the thing.
That's
Which
the way. That's the way to order Mexican food. No, it's low carb that way. It just works.
There you go, protein on protein. But Mike, we talk about go-to pizza orders. We're not talking about this, but here's the controversial part of this, and this is the last bit of this. Is it like I said, it brings me to the controversial follow-up question. Where do you stand on pineapple on pizza?
It's a good question. I've had it before. It's not offensive. It's just not my go-to. So I think he gets a pizza pass, but I probably wouldn't be ordering it voluntarily. I'd eat it if it was in front of me, but not a big fan of the super sweet on top of the cheese.
Yeah, that's a fair way to put it. I'd probably say the same thing. I've had it. I like it. It's usually if I'm like splitting a pizza with my mom, that might be what we go for. But it's never, if I have an option to get, the Buffalo Soldier or just a simple pepperoni and sausage, I think that's the way I'm gonna go.
That's awesome, man.
But that wraps up another great episode of mission compliance. We hope our discussion today has provided you with valuable insights, practical strategies, and inspiration to navigate the ever-evolving world of defense, as well as making you a little bit hungry. We'd like to thank Mike for joining us today and talking to us about this important control. Thanks, Mike.
Hey, always a pleasure, Roman.
But the conversation doesn't end here. We encourage you to continue exploring these topics and connect with us on our social media channels. Share your thoughts, ask questions, and engage with fellow listeners using the hashtag Mission Compliance Podcast. If you haven't already, what should they do, Mike?
Well, like, subscribe, and share with your friends. They'll love you for it.
Share with your friends. Tell them sometimes we talk about pizza. Tell them sometimes we talk about the fact that Mike hasn't seen movies he should have seen. But
Oh, man.
most of the time we talk about defense, but we try to make it as fun as possible. And by liking and subscribing on your favorite podcast platform, as Mike said, it'll let you know when new episodes like this one are released. We'd appreciate it also if you could take a moment to rate and review the show, because your feedback is what helps us to continue to bring you thought-provoking episodes and high-quality content. Join us next time as we delve further into the dynamic world of defense, security, and industry innovation. And on top of that, as we edge closer to episode 50. Until then, yeah, I think this is 43. We're getting close. Until then, take care, stay informed, and make compliance your mission. See you next time.
Thanks, everybody.